Dust devils danced across the Wyoming square, swirling around three small, hooded figures bound on the auction block. Eliza Thorne meant only to pass through, hardened by solitude. But then, a whisper cut through the jeers. Her name, spoken by a boy hidden beneath burlap. In that fractured second, grief collided with mystery. She bought them. 3 orphans. 3 sacks. One name that could unravel a lonely widow's world, or stitch it whole. What name could bind them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've got something extra special saved just for you. The wind off the Bitterroot Flats wasn't kind. It clawed at the weathered falls fronts of Prospect Creek, Wyoming, lifting ochre dust in gritty veils that stung the eyes and coated the tongue. Eliza Thorne pulled her faded shawl tighter, the coarse wool offering scant protection. She rode not into the town square, but alongside it, her old mare, Bess, plodding with the weary resignation of one who knew the weight of empty sacks and emptier hopes. The widow Thorne needed nails from Henderson's mercantile, a grudging necessity forcing her from the brittle silence of her homestead 5 miles east. Interaction was a currency she spent sparingly, hoarding her solitude like the last jar of peaches in a lean winter. The square, such as it was, a patch of hard-packed earth ringed by a saloon, the mercantile, a blacksmith whose anvil lay silent, and the sagging timber frame of the town hall, pulsed with an unusual thrum. A cluster of men, mostly ranch hands smelling of sweat and cheap whiskey, and a handful of women with faces pinched tight against the dust, gathered near the hall steps. On a makeshift platform of warped planks, a man in a stained waistcoat waved his arms, his voice a nasal counterpoint to the wind's low moan. Auction day. Eliza averted her gaze, focusing on the mercantile door. Livestock, maybe a piece of unwanted furniture, not her concern. Bess, however, balked. A tremor ran through the mare's flank, her ears flattening. Eliza's gloved hands tightened on the reins, her own unease prickling. It wasn't the crowd, Bess knew towns. It was a scent, perhaps, carried on the erratic breeze. Not just dust and horseflesh, but something sharper, fainter, fear. And then she saw them. Not calves, not chairs. 3 small figures, hunched and bound at the wrist with coarse rope, standing awkwardly on the planks beside the auctioneer. Each wore a rough burlap sack pulled over their head, tied loosely at the neck. The fabric obscured everything but the shape of skulls, the slight tremor that ran through the smallest one like a trapped bird's wing. They stood utterly still, a terrible, dehumanized silence emanating from them, more potent than any cry. The tallest, perhaps nearing 12, held his shoulders rigid, a defiant line beneath the shameful shroud. The middle one seemed to fold inward, shrinking. The smallest trembled constantly. Lot 27, the auctioneer brayed, slapping a hand against a dusty ledger. Strong backs, mostly trained. Orphans of the prairie, no kin, no claim. A bargain for honest work. Who'll start me at $5? Feed him scraps, they'll earn their keep. Eliza felt a coldness seep into her bones, colder than the mountain wind. Children, parcels, the casual cruelty of it, the utter indifference of the onlookers. A rancher scratching his chin, a woman tittering behind her hand, the auctioneer's bored impatience. Scraped raw against the scar tissue of her own losses. She hadn't asked for this sight, hadn't wanted the memory of another small, still form flashing behind her eyes. Her grip on the reins turned her knuckles white beneath the worn leather. $4, then? Come now, gentlemen. Look at the size on the eldest. He'll chop your wood, tend your stock. A grunt came from the crowd. $3.50, if they ain't simple. The auctioneer sighed theatrically. $3.50, do I hear 4? $3.50 for 3 able bodies. Eliza urged Bess forward, a sharp nudge with her heels. Get the nails. Go home. The dust swirled, momentarily blinding. She passed closer to the platform than she intended. The scent of unwashed bodies, sour breath trapped beneath burlap, and that acrid tang of terror hit her. The smallest figure flinched violently as Bess's shadow fell over him. The auctioneer droned on, the price inching down. Then it happened. Not a shout, not a plea. A sound so faint it might have been the wind catching in the eaves of the blacksmith's shop. A whisper, thin and cracked, muffled by the sack, yet impossibly clear in the space directly before her. Eliza. Her name. Not Widow Thorne. Not ma'am. Eliza. A name whispered only by her husband in the deep night. A name buried with him beneath the lone cottonwood on her land. A name the wind hadn't spoken in 5 long years. It pierced the armor of her solitude like a needle through worn canvas. Her head snapped towards the smallest hooded figure. He was trembling violently now, a leaf in a gale. Had she imagined it? A trick of the wind, a hallucination born of dust and grief? But the sound, it had shape, intention. Her shape, her name. $3, the auctioneer declared, slamming his hand down. Going once. Going. 5. The word left Eliza's lips before thought could catch it. Flat, hard, cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a knife. Silence fell thicker than the dust. Heads turned, eyes, curious and skeptical, fixed on the woman astride the bony mare, her face half hidden by her shawl. The auctioneer blinked, peering at her. Ma'am, you bid $5? For the lot. $5. Eliza reached into the deep pocket of her skirt, fingers closing around the small, heavy pouch that held her meager savings, egg money, the pittance from last season's sparse vegetables, coins saved nail by painful nail. She drew out $5 silver, the metal cold and heavy in her palm. The price of nails, seed, maybe a length of calico. Gone. A ripple went through the crowd. Whispers now speculative. Widow Thorne, what you want with them? Ain't got enough trouble? The auctioneer recovered quickly, a greasy smile spreading. Sold. To the Widow Thorne for $5. A charitable impulse, ma'am, most charitable. He held out his hand. Eliza nudged Bess closer to the platform. She leaned down, dropping the coins into his waiting palm without letting her skin touch his. The finality of the clink echoed in the sudden quiet. Untie them, the bindings, and the sacks. The auctioneer hesitated, then shrugged, barking at a lounging youth nearby. The boy shuffled forward, knife flashing, severing the ropes around the children's wrists. He moved to the sacks. The tallest boy flinched back as the knife neared his neck, a stifled gasp escaping his sack. The middle one stood frozen. The auctioneer's assistant yanked the rough burlap from their heads. Eliza's breath caught. 3 faces, pale and blinking like creatures dragged from a dark burrow into harsh light. The eldest had a shock of unruly, sun-bleached hair above wary, flint gray eyes that darted around, assessing, guarding. A fading bruise mottled one sharp cheekbone. The middle boy, maybe 9, had hair the color of tarnished copper and eyes wide with fear, so profound it looked like sickness. He kept his gaze fixed on his worn, 2 large boots. The smallest, the one who had whispered, couldn't have been more than 6. Fine, dark hair stuck to a damp forehead. His eyes, a startling deep brown like rich earth after rain, locked onto Eliza's face with an intensity that was unnerving. Not pleading, not scared, knowing. His lower lip trembled, but he held her gaze. A thin, silvery scar traced a faint line from his temple into his hairline. Well, there you are, ma'am, the auctioneer said, pocketing the coins. All yours. Mind the little one don't bite. He's got a ton on him, apparently. He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. Eliza ignored him. She dismounted, landing lightly in the dust. The boy shrank back a step as one, a small, frightened unit. The eldest subtly shifted to stand slightly in front of the other 2. Eliza met his gray eyes, seeing the defiance warring with confusion. She didn't speak. She simply held out her hand, palm up, not reaching, just offering a direction, away from here, towards Bess, standing patiently, her saddle empty. The eldest boy glanced at her hand, then at the crowd, his jaw working. The copper-haired boy looked ready to bolt. The small one with the dark eyes kept staring at Eliza. Then, slowly, hesitantly, the small boy reached out his own grubby hand, not to take hers, but to gently tug on the frayed edge of her dusty skirt. It was an instinctive gesture, trusting and terrifying in its vulnerability. The eldest flinched, as if expecting a blow. Eliza didn't move her offered hand. She nodded once, a barely perceptible dip of her chin. "Come," she said, her voice rough from disuse, quieter than the wind. "It's a walk." She turned, leading Bess by the reins, not looking back, trusting the terrible momentum of her decision to carry them forward. For a heart-stopping moment, there was only the crunch of her own boots on the grit. Then, the softer, hesitant scuff of 3 pairs of small feet followed. She heard the auctioneer's dismissive snort, the low murmur of the crowd resuming, already losing interest. They were her burden now, her mystery. The 5 miles stretched long and silent under the vast, indifferent Wyoming sky. Eliza walked, Bess plodded, and the 3 boys trailed behind, a ragged, uncertain procession leaving the meager shelter of Prospect Creek for the immense exposure of the open range. She didn't speak. What could she say? The wind filled the silence, whistling through the sagebrush that dotted the tawny landscape, carrying the scent of dry earth and resilience. She felt their presence like ghosts at her back, the tension radiating from the eldest, the palpable fear from the middle, the unnerving watchfulness of the small one. Occasionally, a stumble, a stifled sniff. Her mind was a whirlwind. The $5 gone, the sudden weight of 3 lives, the echoing whisper of her name. She touched the smooth, cool metal of her wedding band, hidden beneath her glove, a talisman against the tide of panic rising in her chest. "John, what have I done?" Her homestead came into view as they crested the last rise, a low, single-room cabin built of rough-hewn logs, grayed by sun and wind, its sod roof sprouting hardy weeds. A crooked stone chimney poked skyward. Beside it stood a lean-to stable, barely large enough for Bess and her old mule Jasper. The remnants of a vegetable garden lay choked by weeds near the well with its weathered bucket. Beyond stretched fields gone fallow years ago, surrendering to bunchgrass and sage, bounded by a skeletal fence missing more posts than it held. Isolation wasn't just a state of mind here, it was the landscape itself. She led Bess into the stable, the familiar scent of dry hay and horse offering a sliver of comfort. The boys huddled just outside the doorway, a tight knot of apprehension against the vastness. The eldest watched her unsaddle Bess with sharp eyes. The copper-haired boy stared at the ground, shoulders hunched. The small one looked around, his dark eyes taking the cabin, the well, the empty fields, the distant, purple haze mountains. No fear in his gaze now, only a profound, unsettling curiosity. "Wait," Eliza said, her voice still unfamiliar in her own ears. She carried the saddle inside the cabin, leaving the door ajar. The interior was dim, smelling of wood smoke, dried herbs, and loneliness. A stone hearth dominated one wall, cold ash within, a rough-hewn table, 2 stools, a narrow cot pile with a patched quilt, and a single shelf holding a few tin plates, and a chipped enamel coffee pot constituted the furnishings. A faded sampler, embroidered with clumsy flowers, hung crookedly near the hearth, her one attempt at domestic art, years ago. It felt impossibly small, suddenly, meant for one ghost, not 4 living souls. She returned with a dented tin pail. Wordlessly, she walked to the well, the rope groaning in protest as she lowered the bucket, the splash echoing in the stillness. She hauled it up, heavy and cold, filling the pail, setting it down near the boys. She dipped a chipped enamel cup into the clear water. "Drink," she said, holding it out first to the small one. He looked at the cup, then at her, then stepped forward. His small hands, still marked by the rope's chafing, closed around the cup. He drank deeply, water spilling down his chin. He handed the cup back, his eyes meeting hers again. "Thank you, ma'am," he murmured, his voice clearer now, though still soft. She refilled the cup, offering it to the copper-haired boy. He hesitated, glancing at the eldest, who gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. The boy took the cup with trembling hands, drank quickly, and thrust it back. "Thank you," he whispered, the words barely audible. The eldest took the cup last. He drank slowly, watching her over the rim, his gray eyes guarded but no longer actively hostile. He handed the cup back. "Thank you," he said, his voice deeper than she expected, rough-edged. Eliza refilled the cup and drank herself, the cold water shock grounding her. She set the pail down. "Names," she stated, not a question, but a necessity. She looked at the eldest. He straightened slightly. "Silas, ma'am." Her gaze shifted to the copper-haired boy. He flinched. "And Micah, ma'am." Finally, she looked down at the small one, the one whose whisper had shattered her world. He met her gaze unflinchingly. "Levi," he said, clear and certain. "Silas, Micah, Levi," names attached to the hooded shapes, to the wary eyes. Levi, the name-bearer. The question burned, a live coal in her chest. How? But the sun was dipping toward the bitterroots, casting long, hungry shadows. Practicality, the harsh mistress of the frontier, reasserted itself. Shelter, warmth, food, questions could freeze. "Inside," she said, gesturing toward the cabin door. "It's shelter." Silas went first, stepping cautiously over the threshold, his eyes scanning the dim interior like a scout entering hostile territory. Micah followed, pressing close to Silas's side, his fear a palpable cloud. Levi came last, pausing just inside, his dark eyes sweeping the room, the cold hearth, the narrow cot, the sample on the wall, before settling on the iron poker leaning beside the fireplace. He blinked, a flicker of recognition, dread. Eliza couldn't decipher it. She moved to the hearth, kneeling to build a fire. The tinder was dry, the kindling catching quickly. She added a small log, the flames beginning to lick hungrily at the wood, casting flickering, dancing shadows on the rough walls. The warmth was a physical presence, pushing back the encroaching chill of dusk. The boy stood near the door, a silent tableau of exhaustion and wary uncertainty. Silas watched the flames. Michael watched Silas. Levi watched Eliza, his gaze intense, unsettling. Eliza rose, dusting her hands on her skirt. She went to the shelf, retrieving a cloth-wrapped bundle, the last of her cornbread, hard and crumbly. She broke it into 3 pieces, handing one to each boy. Silas took his with a curt nod. Micah clutched his, staring at it as if unsure what to do. Levi held his peace, not eating, his eyes still fixed on Eliza, burning with an unasked question in the firelight. The crackle of the flames filled the small cabin, a sound usually comforting, now underscored by the ragged breathing of the boys and the deafening echo of the unspoken howl. Hanging between her and Levi, she turned toward the shelf again, reaching for the tin plates, the mundane task a shield against the enormity of what she'd done. Outside, the Wyoming wind picked up, moaning around the cabin corners like a restless spirit. Inside, the firelight danced on Levi's face as he finally lifted the cornbread to his lips. Before he took a bite, his small voice, barely louder than the settling embers, cut through the domestic pretense. "The man," Levi whispered, his dark eyes huge and ancient in the firelight, fixed not on Eliza, but on the iron poker beside the hearth. He had the poker too. A shiver, unrelated to the cold, racked his small frame. Silas's head snapped up, his gray eyes wide with sudden alarm. Micah whimpered, dropping his cornbread. The log in the fire cracked, a sharp, violent sound in the sudden, frozen silence. The poker gleamed dully, an ordinary tool transformed into a chilling symbol of an unknown horror. Levi's words weren't just memory. They were an omen, scratching at the door of Eliza's fragile refuge. The poker's shadow stretched long and thin across the cabin floor, a black serpent frozen in the firelight. Levi's words, he had the poker too, hung in the air like in smoke, thick and suffocating. Micah's cornbread lay shattered on the dirt floor, crumbs scattering like broken promises. Silas's hand shot out, gripping Levi's shoulder, not roughly, but with the desperate vigilance of a sentinel facing an unseen enemy. His gray eyes locked onto Eliza's, not accusing, but pleading for an answer she didn't possess. Eliza moved first. Practicality was the only shield against the dread coiling in her chest. She crossed to the door, her boot scraping against packed earth, and slid the heavy oak bar into its brackets with a final, hollow thud. The sound echoed through the cabin's stillness, louder than any shout. Outside, the wind moaned through the sagebrush, a lonely chorus to their fear. She checked the latch on the lone window, its glass clouded and cracked, then turned to the hearth. The iron poker lay where it always had, leaning against soot-stained stones. She lifted it, cold, ordinary, yet in her hands, it felt weighted with Levi's terror. She placed it high on a shelf, behind a chipped jug of dried yarrow, hiding it from sight, but not from memory. "Nobody's here," she said, her voice low, meant to soothe but landing like gravel. "Just the wind." Levi's gaze never left the shelf where the poker had been. Micah trembled, pressing into Silas's side. Silas stood rigid, one arm around his brother, his free hand clenched. "Who was he?" Silas asked, the question sharp, meant for Levi. The small boy flinched. "I don't know," he whispered. "Just the bad place. Dark, cold." His fingers traced a silvery scar on his temple, a map of pain Eliza hadn't noticed before. A memory sliced through her. John's hands, callous and gentle, stoking this very heart the winter the fever took him. "Fire's life out here, Eliza," he'd said, sweat beading on his brow despite the chill. She blinked, pushing the image away. Grief was a ghost that fed on silence. Tonight, it would not starve. "Come," she ordered, softer now. She unfolded a patched quilt from her cot, its faded blues and reds woven by hands she'd long buried. She spread it near the hearth, where the fire's warmth pooled thickest. "Sit." The boys obeyed, sinking onto the quilt like wounded birds seeking shelter. Silas sat closest to the door, watchful. Micah curled into himself, knees to chest. Levi stared into the flames, his dark eyes reflecting the dance of light and shadow. Eliza ladled water from the pail into a dented tin pot, added a handful of dried prairie peas and a pinch of salt. Precious things hoarded for harder days. As it simmered, the scent of simple sustenance mingled with wood smoke, a fragile claim on normalcy. Silas broke the silence. "I'll fetch wood." He stood abruptly, shoulders squared. A bid for control, for usefulness. Eliza shook her head. "Barred door stays barred tonight." He hesitated, then nodded, sinking back down. A silent pact formed in that moment. He would guard the threshold. She would guard the light. When the thin broth was ready, she poured it into 3 chipped enamel mugs. Micah accepted his with both hands, the warmth seeping into his frozen fingers. He sipped, and a shudder ran through him, not fear this time, but relief. Levi cradled his mug, steam curling around his face. "In the dream place," he murmured, so quiet the fire almost swallowed the words. A voice said, "Eliza," like wind through grass. It said you'd come. Eliza stilled. A dream place, not memory. Then something stranger, thinner. "When?" she asked, kneeling before him. "Before the sacks, before the ropes." His brow furrowed. "I saw your face. And the ring." He pointed to her left hand, where her wedding band lay hidden beneath her glove. She hadn't removed her gloves since town. "How?" The question was a live wire in her chest. John's ring was a secret grief, a weight she carried alone. No one in Prospect Creek knew she still wore it. Micah whimpered, drawing his knees tighter. The bad man dreamed too. He knew things. Silas's jaw tightened. Hush, Micah. But Levi's revelation had opened a door. Eliza touched her gloved hand, the metal cool against her skin. Dreams lie, she said more to herself than them. Not this one, Levi insisted, with a certainty only children possess. The voice was kind. Night deepened. The fire dwindled to embers, painting the cabin in shades of rust and gloom. Eliza banked the coals, then spread her second quilt over the boys. Silas lay facing the door, one arm thrown protectively over Micah, who trembled even in sleep. Levi nestled between them, his breathing soft and even, his scar a pale thread in the dimness. Eliza settled on a stool, John's old sheepskin coat around her shoulders, its smell of lanolin and dust a ghostly embrace. She wouldn't sleep. The wind prowled outside, rattling the shutters, and Levi's words prowled inside. The bad man dreamed too. A memory surfaced, unbidden. A tiny grave on a rise behind the cabin, marked only by a river stone. She'd buried a son there, stillborn and unnamed, in the cruel spring after John's death. The grief had calcified into solitude. Now, watching these three boys, their breath rising and falling in the quilt's hollows, she felt the stone in her chest crack. What if the dream place is real? The thought was madness. And yet, Levi had known her name, known the ring. Midnight bled toward dawn. The cold bit deeper. Eliza stirred, adding a last knotty branch to the embers. As flames licked greedily at the wood, a sound cut through the wind's drone, a sharp metallic clink, like a hoof striking stone. Near the well, her breath caught. Silas's eyes flew open, instantly alert. He raised a finger to his lips, then pointed to the window. Eliza rose, pokerless, and crept to the clouded glass. Frost feathered its edges, crystalline and sharp. She peered out. Moonlight silvered the yard, casting long, distorted shadows. The well stood 20 paces away, its bucket swaying faintly on its rope. Nothing moved. Then, a flicker near the stable. A shape low and four-legged? A coyote? But coyotes didn't wear boots. She squinted. Tracks marred the frost-dusted path from the gate. Deep, purposeful grooves, not the scattershot prints of wildlife. Silas joined her, his shoulder brushing hers. Together, they watched. The wind sighed, stirring the sage. A shadow detached itself from the stable's lee, tall, hat brim pulled low. Not an animal. Human. It paused, head turning toward the cabin. Moonlight glinted on something metal at its hip. A buckle? A gun? Eliza's blood turned to ice. The man with the poker. Levi's fear-given form. The figure took a step forward, then another, boots crunching faintly on the frozen earth. It stopped at the edge of the firelight's reach, silhouetted against the indigo sky. One hand rested on its belt, near where a holster would be. Silas's hand found Eliza's sleeve, gripping tight. Inside, Micah whimpered in his sleep. Levi sat up, suddenly awake, his dark eyes wide and unblinking. He didn't look at the window. He looked at the door. A fist hammered against the oak. 3 heavy, deliberate blows that shook the bar in its brackets. Boom, boom, boom. The sound tore through the cabin's fragile peace. Micah jolted upright with a cry. Silas shoved Eliza behind him, his body a thin shield against the wood. Levi scrambled back, pressing against the hearthstones, his face ashen. Outside, the wind died. An awful silence followed, thicker than the cold. Then a voice, rough, deep, and laced with familiarity that turned Eliza's bones to water, slithered through the cracks in the door. Evening, Eliza, it said, heard you got something belongs to me. The voice hung in the frozen air like poison. Something belongs to me. It wasn't a shout, but low, insinuating rasp that seeped through the cracks in the door. colder than a Wyoming night. Micah whimpered, burying his face in the quilt. Levi pressed himself against the rough-hewn stones of the hearth, his small body rigid, eyes wide and fixed on the barred oak as if it might splinter. Silas stood like a young oak before Eliza, his thin frame trembling not with fear, but with a fierce, protective rage. His gray eyes, reflecting the dying ember's glow, flicked between the door and Eliza, waiting for her command. Eliza's hand found Silas's shoulder, a silent plea for stillness. Her own heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. That voice that scraped against a raw nerve buried deep in memory, a sound both foreign and terrifyingly intimate. She forced her breath to slow, the widow's discipline of solitude clamping down on panic. Think, act. Who's out there? Silas demanded, his voice cracking only slightly. The answer came, laced with dark amusement. A concerned citizen, boy. Just come for what's mine. Open up, Eliza. Let's not make this difficult. A boot scuffed heavily on the porch plank outside. Difficult. The word was a threat, plain as the pistol she didn't own. Eliza's gaze swept the dim cabin, the hidden poker, the chipped kitchen knife lying near the tin plates on the shelf. Too far. Her hand tightened on Silas's shoulder, pulling him a fraction back. She met his eyes, shook her head once, sharply. Silence. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by Micah's muffled sobs and the wind's mournful howl around the eaves. The fire had dwindled to a bed of crimson coals, casting long, dancing shadows that made the walls seem to breathe. Frost feathered the single window pane, intricate and deadly. Minutes bled into an eternity. No further knock came. No voice. Only the relentless wind and the terrifying possibility that the man was still out there, waiting, listening. Eliza felt Silas's tension thrumming beneath her hand. Levi hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, his gaze still locked on the door. His small face was pale as milk, the silvery scar stark against his temple. Slowly, cautiously, Eliza released Silas and crept towards the clouded window. She pressed her face against the cold glass, cupping her hands around her eyes to block the weak firelight. Moonlight washed the yard in shades of bone and indigo. The well, the stable, the skeletal fence posts, all lay still under the vast, indifferent sky. Empty. Had he gone? Or was he merely hidden, a shadow among shadows? She scanned the frost-dusted ground near the porch. The moonlight caught something small and dark, lying just beyond the bottom step. Not a stone. Something leather. A tobacco pouch? Or... Silas appeared silently beside her, following her gaze. "What is it?" he breathed. "Don't know," Eliza murmured. Her mind raced. A drop clue? A trap? Leaving the cabin was madness. Staying felt like waiting for a wolf to chew through the door. Micah's whimper rose to a thin, keening cry. "He's coming back. He'll get us." He scrambled towards Silas, clutching his arm. "Micah, hush." Silas hissed, trying to pry his brother loose without taking his eyes off the window. Levi finally stirred. He uncurled from his spot by the hearth, his bare feet silent on the packed earth. He didn't look at the door or the window. He walked to the rough-hewn table where Eliza's meager supplies sat. His small hand reached out and touched the chipped enamel coffee pot. Not the pot itself, but a spot near its base. He traced an invisible line in the dust with his fingertip. He had one like this, Levi whispered, his voice thin and distant. In the dream place. He dropped it. It made a sound like crying. Eliza's blood ran cold. The clink they'd heard earlier, near the well, like metal on stone, like an enamel pot dropped. Levi wasn't just remembering. He was connecting. The dream place bleeding into the waking world. The weight of the unknown pressed down, heavier than the sod roof. Eliza needed to see that object outside. Needed Silas to see it too, to confirm she wasn't conjuring phantoms from fear and frost. She turned to him, her decision hardening like ice. "Silas," she said, her voice low and urgent. Listen close. When I lift the bar, you open the door just wide enough to look. See that dark thing near the bottom step? Tell me what it is. Quick as a blink. Then slam it shut. Understand? Fear warred with fierce resolve in his gray eyes. He glanced at his terrified brothers. Then back at Eliza, he gave a sharp nod. Yes, ma'am. Micah, Levi. Eliza commanded, turning to the younger boys. Get behind the table. Now, and not a sound. Her tone brooked no argument, the voice of survival honed by years alone against the elements. Micah scrambled, dragging Levi with him, both boys crouching low, their eyes huge saucers in the gloom. Eliza moved to the door, her hand hovering over the heavy oak bar. Every nerve screamed danger. This could be the moment the wolf pounced. She took a breath, the air sharp with cold and wood smoke. John, if you're watching, she heaved the bar up and clear. Now, she hissed. Silas yanked the door open a bare 6 inches. Frigid air blasted in, carrying the scent of frost and sage. He leaned out, peering into the moonlight for a single, heart-stopping second. Looks like a glove, he gasped, already pulling back. Leather, big, worn thin at the... He never finished. From the deep shadow beside the porch, a figure lunged. A hand, clad in a matching leather glove, shot out, grabbing the edge of the door, preventing Silas from slamming it shut. Silas cried out, throwing his weight against the wood. Eliza surged forward, adding her strength. The door shuddered, caught in a brutal tug-of-war. Through the narrow gap, Eliza caught a glimpse. The lower half of a face, shadowed by a hat brim, a mouth set in a cruel line, a jaw darkened by stubble, and eyes, cold, hard eyes that glittered like chips of obsidian in the moonlight, locking onto hers with predatory intent. They held no recognition, only a chilling possessiveness. Let go, boy, the man snarled, his breath a plume of frost in the gap. He shoved hard. The door groaned on its hinges, inching open despite their combined effort. Micah screamed. Panic, pure and primal, flooded Eliza. The knife, it was on the shelf behind her, uselessly out of reach. The poker, hidden too far. She braced her shoulder against the wood, her boots slipping on the dirt floor. Silas grunted with effort, his face contorted. Then Levi moved, not towards the door, not away. He darted to the hearth, ignoring the heat radiating from the embers. He snatched up the heavy iron lid lifter resting beside the ash bucket. It was a crude, hook-bar black iron, meant for shifting burning logs. He hefted it with both small hands, his face in a mask of terrified determination. Leave us alone. Levi shrieked, his voice high and thin but piercing. He didn't hesitate. He ran towards the struggling door and thrust a hooked end of the lifter through the gap with all his strength. A roar of pain erupted from outside. The cruel eyes widened in shock and fury. The grip on the door slackened. You little devil, the man bellowed. Silas and Eliza slammed the door shut with a thunderous crash. Eliza rammed the heavy oak bar back into place with trembling hands, sinking the brackets deep. Outside, cursing echoed, followed by the sound of heavy, retreating footsteps crunching on the frost. Silence descended again, broken only by the ragged gasps of her terrified souls and the frantic hammering of their hearts. Silas slumped against the door, panting. Micah was curled into a ball behind the table, sobbing quietly. Levi stood frozen, the iron lifter still clutched in his hands, staring at the door as if it might burst open again. Eliza staggered back, her legs weak. She looked at Levi, the small boy who had known her name, known her ring, and now, wielding fire iron like a weapon, he had struck the wolf. She crossed a few steps to him, knelt, and gently pried the heavy lifter from his stiff fingers. It clattered to the floor. His hands were reddened, not from the heat, but from the force of his grip. Levi, she breathed, her voice raw. Are you hurt? He shook his head mutely, his dark eyes enormous, filled with a terror that mirrored her own. He looked down at his empty hands, then up at her. He saw me, Levi whispered. He saw me. The implication hung heavy in the air. The man knew Levi had fought back, knew his face. Eliza gathered the small, trembling boy into her arms. He didn't resist, burying his face against her worn shawl. She felt the frantic beat of his heart against her own. Silas pushed himself away from the door and came to stand beside them, placing a protective hand on Levi's back. His gaze met Eliza's over Levi's head, the defiance in his eyes now edged with new, grim understanding. The threat wasn't gone. It had seen them. It knew where they were, and it had been wounded. Eliza held Levi close, rocking slightly, her eyes fixed on the bar door. The coals in the hearth pulsed faintly, offering little light and less warmth against the deep cold settling over the cabin. Outside, the wind had stilled, replaced by an unnatural, watchful silence. Somewhere out there in the vast, moonlit darkness, the man with the cold eyes was licking his wounds and planning his return. The fragile peace of her lonely homestead was shattered. The boys were hers now, in blood and fear, as much as her own grief. Dawn felt like a lifetime away, and the darkness held teeth. The silence after the man's retreat was a living thing, thick and brittle as river ice. Only the ragged symphony of their breathing. Eliza's shallow gasps, Silas's harsh pants, Micah's muffled sobs, and Levi's near-silent whimpers filled the cabin's oppressive gloom. The fire was dead, its embers winking out like dying stars, leaving only the faint, gray light of pre-dawn seeping through the frosted window. The air tasted metallic, sharp with spent fear and the lingering chill of the intruder's presence. Eliza kept her arms wrapped tightly around Levi, his small frame shuddering against her chest. The iron lifter lay discarded on the dirt floor, a cold, accusing shape. Silas remained braced against the door, his ear pressed to the wood, listening with every fiber of his being. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the heavy bar. "He gone," Silas whispered, his voice cracking the silence like thin ice. Eliza strained her own hearing. The wind had stilled completely. No crunch of boots, no labored breathing from the porch. Just a vast, watchful silence of the Wyoming plains pressing in. "Seems so," she murmured, her own voice raw. "For now." The qualification hung heavy. For now. Dawn was a promise, but it felt desperately far away. Slowly, carefully, Eliza eased Levi back. His dark eyes, wide and haunted, met hers. The terror was still there, but beneath it, a spark of defiance flickered, the same spark that had driven him to seize the lifter. "He saw me," Levi repeated, his whisper barely audible. "He saw," Eliza confirmed, her voice low and steady, trying to instill a calm she didn't feel. "But he didn't get in. You stopped him, Levi." She touched his cheek, her thumb brushing near the silvery scar. The boy flinched minutely, a reaction ingrained deeper than conscious thought. "You were brave." Micah uncurled slightly from his ball behind the table, his face tear-streaked and pale. He hurt him? "Scared him off," Silas corrected gruffly, pushing himself away from the door. He flexed his hands, trying to dispel the tremor. "We hurt him back." He looked at the lifter on the floor, then at Levi, a new, grudging respect in his gray eyes. "Good thinking, Sprout." Levi didn't respond. He stared at the door. Then his gaze drifted towards a window, towards the spot where the man had dropped the glove. "It's still there," he whispered. "The leather thing." Eliza followed his gaze. The glove, a tangible piece of the shadow that hunted them. Fear warred with necessity. They couldn't stay barricaded forever. They needed water. Bess and Jasper needed tending. And that glove, it was a clue, a sliver of the man's identity lying exposed in the frost. "Silas," Eliza said, her decision hardening. "We need to know." She nodded toward the window. "Dawn's coming. Light enough soon. We fetch that glove. Quick and quiet. You watch my back." Silas straightened, his jaw set. The responsibility settled on his young shoulders, visibly steeling him. "Yes, ma'am." He glanced at Micah and Levi. "You two stay put, behind the table. Don't move, don't make a sound." Micah nodded frantically, pulling Levi with him back into their makeshift shelter. Levi resisted for a second, his eyes fixed on Eliza, a silent question burning in them. She gave him the smallest nod of reassurance before turning to the door. The lifting of the bar this time was a deliberate act, not a panicked reaction. The hinges groaned softly as Eliza eased the door open just wide enough to slip through. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. Frost painted the world in shades of silver and gray, crunching under her worn boots as she stepped onto the porch. The air was knife-sharp, scented with sage and frozen earth. Silas followed, pressing close behind her, his head swiveling constantly, scanning the yard, the stable, the distant, shadowed rise. The glove lay where it had fallen, near the bottom step. A worn work glove, heavy cowhide darkened with grease and grime, the fingertips worn thin. Eliza snatched it up, the leather cold and stiff. She stuffed it quickly into the pocket of her skirt, her eyes scanning the ground around it. Frost obscured much, but near the edge of the porch, where the man had lunged from the shadows, the frost was scuffed away, revealing the hard-packed earth beneath. And there, pressed deep into the dirt, was a clear, sharp outline of a boot heel, not the rounded print of a ranch hand or farmer, but a distinct, pointed heel, the mark of a riding boot, expensive and out of place on the frontier. Silas saw it too. He pointed, a silent question in his eyes. Eliza nodded. They retreated swiftly, Silas pulling the door shut behind them. The heavy thud of the bar, sliding home, felt like a temporary victory. Back inside, the cabin felt marginally safer, though the cold had invaded. Micah and Levi peered out from behind the table. Eliza pulled the glove from her pocket. It felt heavy, imbued with menace. She held it up in the strengthening gray light, filtering through the window. "Look," Silas breathed, pointing. Stitched clumsily onto the leather cuff, nearly worn away but still visible, were two faded letters, CV. Levi gasped. He scrambled out from behind the table, his small hand reaching out, not to touch the glove, but hovering near the letters. His face had drained of all color. "CV," he whispered, the sound like dry leaves skittering. In the dream place, the bad man, they called him Vance. Cleve Vance. He looked up at Eliza, his eyes wide with a dawning horror that went beyond immediate fear. He made the sacks. A cold deeper than the Wyoming winter seeped into Eliza's bones. Cleve Vance. The name meant nothing to her, yet it landed with the weight of an anvil, a name for the nightmare, a man who dealt in hooded children. She looked down at the glove in her hand, the worn leather, the pointed heel mark outside, signs of a man who moved with purpose, who considered children property. Something belongs to me. The practicalities of survival reasserted themselves, a lifeline against the tide of dread. We need light, warmth. Eliza moved to the cold hearth. Her hands, stiff with cold and lingering fear, fumbled with the flint striker. It took several tries before a spark caught the dry tinder. A small, fragile flame bloomed, hungry and bright. She fed it carefully, adding kindling, then a small log. The fire's crackle was a counterpoint to the heavy silence, pushing back the shadows inch by inch. As warmth began to seep into the small space, a different kind of cold gnawed at Eliza. The boys huddled near the growing fire, Silas watching the door, Micah shivering despite the heat, Levi staring into flames as if seeing horrors reflected there. She thought of the tiny, unmarked grave on the rise behind the cabin, the son she'd never held, never named, buried beside his father under the lone cottonwood. The grief had been a stone wall, shutting out the world. Now, faced with these three terrified boys and the monster named Cleve Vance, the wall felt less like protection and more like a prison she'd built for herself. She pulled off her worn leather glove. The plain gold wedding band gleamed dully in the firelight. She rarely looked at it directly. It was a weight, a reminder, but now she turned it on her finger. "His name was John," she said, her voice low but clear in the quiet cabin. The boys looked up, startled. Silas's watchfulness shifted toward her. "My husband, he built this place." She gestured vaguely around the cabin, planted the idea of life out here, away from everything. Her throat tightened. The fever took him. Winter, 5 years back. She paused, the memory of physical ache. Later, there was a baby, too early, too small. She couldn't say more. The words choked her. She simply touched her belly briefly. Then the ring. It's all I have left of them. She hadn't shared this with a living soul in Prospect Creek. The words hung in the air, fragile as ash. Micah's eyes were wide with sympathy. Silas's gaze held a new understanding, a softening of his perpetual vigilance. Levi just watched her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight and her pain. Silas broke the heavy silence. "We should check the animals. Jasper and Bess. They'll be cold." It was a practical suggestion, a way to do something, a way to reclaim a sliver of normalcy. Eliza nodded, grateful. Quickly, together, she wouldn't let anyone outside alone. She retrieved the hidden poker from the shelf behind the yarrow jug. Its weight was cold comfort. Silas picked up the heavy iron lid lifter Levi had used, his grip firm. Micah, seeing the weapons, whimpered but didn't protest. Levi stayed close to Eliza's side, his small hand finding the rough fabric of her skirt. Unbarring the door felt like tempting fate. The dawn light was stronger now, pale gold bleeding across the eastern sky, washing the frost in a brittle sheen. The yard seemed vast and exposed. Eliza led the way, poker held ready, her senses straining. Silas followed, lifter held like a club, scanning the perimeter. Micah stuck close to Silas, and Levi stayed glued to Eliza. The air was still, unnervingly so. Frost crunched loudly underfoot. Bess whickered softly from the lean-to stable as they approached. Eliza checked the small structure first. Bess and Jasper stood together, their breath pluming in the cold air. They seemed undisturbed, though Bess nuzzled Eliza's hand with unusual urgency. Silas checked the corners, the pile of hay. Nothing. They moved towards the well. The frost near the porch had melted slightly where the man had stood, but the pointed boot heel print was still stark in the hardening mud. Levi pointed silently toward the gate, leading out to the open range. Near one of the leaning fence posts, something fluttered. A scrap of dark cloth caught on a splintered piece of wood. It hadn't been there yesterday. Cautiously, Eliza approached. It was a torn piece of woolen fabric, coarse and dark gray. Not from her things, not from the boys' ragged clothes. Silas reached it first. Pulling it free, he held it up. It was roughly torn, as if snagged in a hurry, and on it, faint but unmistakable in the dawn light, was a dark, rust-colored stain. Blood. Silas's face tightened. From the lifter, he stated flatly. Levi's strike had drawn blood. A cold satisfaction wore with renewed dread in Eliza. They'd marked him, but he was out there. Hurt, maybe, angry, definitely, and he knew where they were. They retreated back to the cabin, the scrap of bloody cloth clutched in Silas's hand like grim proof. As Eliza barred the door once more, the fragile sense of momentary safety evaporated. They had a name. They had proof of his presence. They had drawn his blood. But Cleve Vance wasn't finished. The silence outside felt charged now, pregnant with menace. The vast emptiness of the plains no longer felt like isolation. It felt like a hunting ground. Inside, the fire crackled, offering warmth but little comfort. Eliza looked at the three boys, Silas standing guard, Micah trying to be brave, Levi lost in his visions of the dream place and the man named Vance. She touched her wedding band, the metal warm now from her skin. John's ring, her unnamed son's memory. They felt like anchors, grounding her to a past that offered no protection against the present storm. "We need a plan," she said, her voice low but firm, cutting through the quiet. "He'll be back." She looked at Silas. "We need to be ready." Silas met her gaze, his young face set in lines too old for his years. He nodded. "What do we do?" Before Eliza could formulate an answer, Levi, who had been staring intently at the bloodied scrap of cloth in Silas's hand, suddenly went rigid. His small body tensed, his dark eyes losing focus, looking not at the cloth but through it into some terrible distance. His breath hitched. "He's not alone," Levi whispered, his voice thin and strange, echoing with a chill of the dream place. "He's waiting, and he brought the others." Levi's words, "He's not alone. He brought the others," coiled to the cabin like barbed wire, tightening around Eliza's chest. The bloodied scrap of cloth fell from Silas's hand, a dark punctuation on the dirt floor. Outside, the dawn bled pale gold over the bitterroot flats, gilding the frost-kissed sagebrush and painting long, distorted shadows that seemed to ride with hidden menace. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It vibrated with the promise of violence. Eliza met Silas's gaze. Fear, raw and primal, flickered in his gray eyes, but beneath it burned the same defiant ember that had fueled him since the auction block. Micah whimpered, pressing his face against Levi's shoulder. Levi himself stood rigid, his small face ashen, his dark eyes wide and unfocused, staring into the middle distance as if witnessing the approaching storm in the cursed dream place. "No time for hiding," Eliza said, her voice low and rough, slicing through paralysis. "We make a stand. Here." She strode to the hearth, grabbing the iron poker from its hiding place. Its cold weight was an anchor. "Silas," the lifter. "Micah," she turned to the trembling boy. "You watch the window. Anything moves, you shout. Loud. Understand?" Micah nodded, a jerky movement, his eyes darting to the frosted pane. "Why, yes, ma'am." "Levi." Eliza knelt before him, her hands gripping his thin shoulders. "The dream place. Can you see them? How many? Where?" Levi blinked, his focus returning slowly, painfully. He shuddered. 3 besides him. Horses by the big rocks. East. He pointed a trembling finger vaguely towards a rise where Eliza's heart lay buried beneath a river stone. "They wait. Vance, he's mad. His arm hurts." Levi touched his own left forearm, mirroring where the iron lifter had struck. 3 men, horses hidden east. Vance wounded but furious. The information was a grim gift. Eliza rose, her mind working with the frantic clarity of desperation. They couldn't outrun mounted men. The cabin was their fortress, flimsy as it was. "Barricade the window," she ordered Silas, nodding toward the rickety table. "Tip it on its side. Anything heavy against it." Silas moved without question, his jaw set. He and Eliza heaved the heavy table, scraping across the packed earth, tilting against the clouded window. Its bulk blocked most of the light in the view, but also any easy entry. Micah scrambled to add the 2 stools, piling them haphazardly against the wood. Eliza scanned the cabin's meager defenses. The poker, the lifter, a skinning knife, sharp but short-bladed, tucked in her apron pocket. Against 4 armed men, a hollow laugh threatened to bubble up. She crushed it. "John, what would you do?" The memory surfaced, sharp and clear. John teaching her to track a wounded buck years ago. "Use the land. Eliza, it's your ally. Make it fight for you." The land, the well, the stable, the frost-slick ground. "Silas," she said, a plan forming, reckless and necessary. "We need bait and a trap." He listened, eyes widening slightly as she outlined it. It hinged on Vance's wounded pride, his obsessive claim. It relied on the boys playing their parts. It risked everything. Outside, the unnatural stillness broke. A horse snorted, the sound carrying sharp and clear on the frozen air. Close. Too close. He's here, Levi whispered, pressing himself against the tilted table. Eliza took a steadying breath. She touched the wedding band beneath her glove, the metal warm against her skin. Not a shackle anymore, a reminder. For them, she pulled the bloodied scrap of wool from her pocket and handed it to Silas. Remember your part. Wait for my signal. She then turned to Micah. When I say now, you and Levi run. Not to the stable. To the well. Get behind it. Stay low. Micah swallowed hard, terror warring with a dawning resolve. Run. To the well. He repeated it like a prayer. Eliza unbarred the door, the sound deafening in the taut silence. She stepped onto the porch, poker held low and ready at her side, hidden by the folds of her skirt. The cold air bit her face. The yard lay bathed in the weak, golden light of dawn. Frost glittered like shattered glass on the hard earth. Cleve Vance stood 20 paces away, near the leaning gatepost. He was tall, raw-boned, with a face like weathered saddle leather under a broad-brimmed hat. His left arm was bound tightly against his chest with a strip of dirty cloth, the stain of Levi's blow darkening the fabric. Hatred burned in his cold, obsidian eyes. 3 other men flanked him, rough-cut figures smelling of sweat and cheap whiskey, hands resting near holstered pistols. Their horses were tethered out of sight beyond the rise, just as Levi had said. Well, Vance drawled, his voice a rasp like stone on stone. His gaze raked over Eliza, dismissive yet predatory. The widow Thorne. Heard you were lonesome, but I didn't figure you for buying trouble. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the frost, the dark stain spreading. You got something of mine. 3 somethings. Time to hand them over. They're not yours, Eliza stated, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the brittle air. She kept her posture loose, non-threatening. They're free now. Vance's lips peeled back in a humorless smile, revealing stained teeth. Free? Ain't nothing free in this world, woman. They're mine, bought and paid for, same as a horse. Now, send 'em out or we come in and take 'em. Won't be gentle. Eliza took a single step forward, off the porch, onto the frost-slick path leading to the well. You want them? She challenged, a flicker of defiance sparking in her own eyes. Come get them. She raised her voice slightly. Silas, bring the boys. The cabin door creaked open wider. Silas stood framed in the doorway, the bloodied scrap of cloth held conspicuously in one hand. Micah and Levi huddled just behind him, eyes wide with terror. Vance's gaze locked onto the scrap, onto the visible proof of his injury inflicted by a child. Rage contorted his features. He took a step forward, then another, his boots crunching on the frost. His men shifted, hands moving closer to their guns. Hold! Vance snarled at them without looking back, his eyes fixed on Silas and the cloth. That little rat-faced devil is mine. He strode forward, his focus narrowing entirely on Silas and the symbol of his humiliation. He didn't see Eliza shift her stance subtly. He didn't notice the path he walked was the one she deliberately scuffed free of frost earlier, exposed in the hard-packed, rain-grooved earth beneath. He didn't see the slight dip near the well where runoff pooled, now a thin, treacherous sheet of ice hidden under a dusting of wind-blown snow. Run! Eliza yelled the command, sharp as a pistol shot. Silas didn't hesitate. He threw the bloodied scrap of cloth directly into Vance's face. Here's your property, Vance, he shouted, then turned, shoving Micah and Levi towards the well. Go! Now! Vance roared, batting the cloth away, his good hand clawing for the gun at his hip. He took one furious, lunging step after Silas, his boot landing squarely on the hidden patch of ice. His leg shot out from under him. He crashed backwards onto frozen ground with sickening thud, the breath driven from his lungs in a whoosh. His gun skittered from his grasp, sliding across the frost toward the well. Now! Eliza screamed, not waiting. Silas, already moving, scooped up the heavy iron lid lifter he'd left leaning by the doorframe. He swung it with all his strength, not at Vance, but at the closest of Vance's startled men, catching him a glancing blow on the knee. The man howled, stumbling. Eliza charged. She didn't go for Vance. She went for his gun. She skidded on the frost herself, grabbing the pistol just as Vance, gasping and enraged, started to push himself up. She scrambled backwards, the unfamiliar weight of the firearm heavy and cold in her hands. She leveled it shakily at Vance, then swung the barrel to cover his 3 men who had drawn their own weapons but stood frozen, uncertain. "Drop them," Eliza commanded, her voice trembling but fierce. "Drop them, or I put a hole in your boss." She had no idea if the gun was loaded, if she could hit anything, but the bluff was all she had. Vance struggled to his knees, clutching his injured arm, his face purple with fury and pain. "Shoot her," he wheezed at his men. One of the men, the one Silas hadn't hit, spat on the ground. "Ain't dying for your bad arm, Vance, or your brats." He holstered his pistol slowly. The other 2, glancing at each other, followed suit. Vance stared at them, betrayal etching deep lines in his face. "You yellow-bellied." "Shut up, Vance," the first man said, his voice flat. "This ain't worth dying over." Or Hanjin. He nodded toward the cabin, where Micah and Levi peered out from behind the stone well, their faces pale. Town's been talking about hooded kids sold off. Folks get funny about that, even out here. He turned his horse. "We're riding. You coming, or you staying for breakfast?" The men mounted their horses, not waiting for an answer. Vance hauled himself painfully to his feet, swaying. He glared at Eliza, pure venom in his eyes. He looked at the gun in her hands, at Silas standing defiantly beside her, the lifter still raised, at Micah and Levi emerging cautiously from behind the well. His gaze lingered on Levi, the boy who had whispered his doom. "This ain't over, Thorne," he rasped, clutching his injured arm. "I know where you live." Eliza didn't lower the gun. "Ride out, Vance, and don't come back. Next time I won't miss." She hoped the tremor in her voice sounded like cold fury, not fear. Vance spat blood onto the frost near her boots. Then, limping heavily, he turned and stumbled toward the rise where his horse waited alone. The sound of hooves faded quickly, swallowed by the vast silence of the plains. The gun grew impossibly heavy in Eliza's hands. She lowered it, her arms shaking. Silas let the lid lifter clatter to the ground. Micah burst into tears, great, shuddering sobs of relief. Levi walked slowly towards Eliza, his dark eyes fixed on her face, then on the gun. He didn't speak. Silence settled again, different this time, lighter, fragile. The rising sun warmed Eliza's back, chasing the deep chill from her bones. The frost began to melt, revealing the resilient earth beneath. Back inside the cabin, the barricade was dismantled. The fire was rebuilt, its crackle a comforting counterpoint to the fading adrenaline. Eliza tended to Silas's scraped knuckles and Micah's tear-streaked face with a gentleness that surprised even herself. Levi sat close to the hearth, staring into the flames, quiet but present. Eliza reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the smooth, cool metal of her wedding band. She pulled it off, the simple gold band gleaming in the firelight. She held it for a long moment, feeling its familiar weight, the ghost of John's touch. Then she walked to the rough-hewn shelf and took down a small, empty spice tin. She placed the ring inside, the metal clinking softly against the tin. "It's not forgetting," she said softly, more to herself and the boys, but they all looked up. "It's making room." She placed the tin carefully back on the shelf, beside the chipped enamel coffee pot. She turned to them. Silas watched her, his usual vigilance softened into something resembling trust. Micah sniffled, managing a small, tentative smile. Levi tilted his head, his dark eyes thoughtful. "The dream place," Levi said quietly, breaking the silence. It wasn't all bad. There was a voice. After Vance left us in the dark, a man's voice. Kind. He said your name. Said you'd help. Said you wore a ring for someone you loved. He looked at the spice tin on the shelf. He sounded sad. Like you. Eliza's breath caught. John? The thought was a wildflower blooming in the ashes of her grief. She didn't question it. Some mysteries were anchors, not weights. She walked to Levi and placed a hand on his dark hair, her touch light. Maybe, she murmured. Maybe he knew I needed you all as much as you needed me. Later, as the sun climbed higher, spilling warm light into the cabin, they stepped outside together. The yard bore the scars of the confrontation. Scuffed earth, the bloodied scrap of cloth trampled into the mud, but the air was clean, sharp with the scent of thawing sage and possibility. In the distance, the Bitterroot Mountain stood sentinel, purple and enduring. Silas picked up the lid lifter, not as a weapon, but as a tool. Fence needs mending, he stated, nodding toward the leaning post near the gate. Micah took a hesitant step towards the overgrown garden plot. We could plant something come spring. Levi simply stood beside Eliza, his small hand finding hers. He didn't flinch. He looked out at the vast land, not with fear, but with a quiet curiosity. Eliza squeezed his hand, looking at the three boys who had fallen into her life like lost stars finding a constellation. The grief for John and the unnamed child was still there, a quiet ache beneath her ribs. But it was no longer a wall. It was a foundation. She looked at the fallow fields, the sagging fence. The cabin had been a tomb and was now, slowly, becoming a home. We start with a fence, Eliza said, her voice strong, clear, carrying on the morning air. She picked up the poker, not for battle, but to pry loose a stubborn post. Then the garden. Then we'll see. The future stretched before them, harsh and beautiful and unwritten, but no longer walked alone. The name that bound them, whispered beneath burlap in a dusty square, had become a promise, echoing in the wide Wyoming sky.